Good morning students, Saira. Today we'll be revising the next lesson in your Voices textbook. That is lesson number 5, Jane Eyre at Lowood Institution. As we all are aware about what the story is, we are just going to revise the story in short and also we'll discuss few answers, question answers based on this. Now as you know, what is the story about? Yes, the story is about a girl named Jane who lived with her uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Reed. As she had lost her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reed took care of Jane. But unfortunately, after a few days, Mr. Reed also died. And Mrs. Reed, as she had promised her husband to take care of Jane, so she had to look after her. But then she ill-treated her and was not given proper treatment. Jane was not given proper treatment by Mrs. Reed. One day, Mrs. Reed had locked her into the room, which was very scary for Jane as she could remember all the memories of Mr. Reed there. And so she had to undergo a treatment under Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd suggested that Jane requires a psychological treatment. Taking advantage of this, Mrs. Reed thought of shifting Jane to Lowood Institution. And so one day she takes Jane to Lowood Institution. Mr. Brocklehurst was the owner of the Lowood Institution. So Mrs. Reed introduces Jane to Mr. Brocklehurst as she is very ungrateful girl and also sometimes speaks lie. So this was the negative impact of Jane which was left over by Mrs. Reed on Brocklehurst. So as a result, even Brocklehurst, when he introduced Jane to other pupils in the institution, he gave the same introduction as told by her aunt. This was this left Jane into depression and many negative thoughts started coming to her mind. And she also had a very different impression about Mr. Brocklehurst. Her friend Helen Burns, who was one of the pupils in the institution, she tried to console her. She tried to make her understand that these things happened because your aunt had left that impression on Mr. Brocklehurst. But then too, Jane was very much hurt and she sat alone in her room crying. So Helen went there with a coffee and a bread for Jane. She tried to talk to her, console her and told her to forget the past events. But Jane was not able to do so. And at that time, the teacher, Miss Temple, came searching for both the girls. And she found these two girls sitting and talking to each other wherein they were discussing about those events. So Miss Temple made Jane understand and she took both the girls to her room. As the three went off to the room, she also gave her a friendly treatment and asked Jane to tell about her in detail. Jane also felt very comfortable as somebody was trying to understand her. And so she told her about all her past events, about Mrs. Reed with whom she was living and how she treated her. So with this, Miss Temple had understood what Jane wanted to say. So Miss Temple also made her understand and she promised that as she was knowing Mr. Lloyd, she would get details about her from him. And so as she had promised her, she contacted Mr. Lloyd and then removed all the false charges which were put up on Jane by Mr. Brocklehurst in front of the whole institution. So now Jane was also very much happy as all her negative charge were removed and she was free enough now to move about in the institution because nobody will look upon her with that bad impression which they had come across. So now she was very much happy living in the institution and did not want to go from there anywhere. So this was the summary of the story, children. I have told to you in short. I hope all of you must have read the lesson, have gone through it. Read the lessons, you will get comprehension, passages from the lesson. So you should be able to solve the answers. Okay. And also find new words from the lesson. Try to find the meanings, the opposite words, tenses of those words from the dictionary. Make use of dictionary at home. Okay. Now, as you all know what the story is about, let's discuss few questions. Okay. Answer the following questions. Who came to console Jane? So as we have seen that Jane was very much depressed after the treatment she was being given in the institution. Who came to console her? Yes, children? Yes, it was Helen Burns came to console Jane. She tried to make her understand. Now, who is Helen Burns? Yes, who is Helen Burns? Yes, Helen Burns is Jane's friend and another pupil in the school. So, she was her friend and also she was living in that same school. What was Jane mistaken about? So, what was Jane mistaken about? Yes? Yes, Jane was mistaken about herself after what Mr. Brocklehurst had told everyone about her, and she thought that everyone would despise her and dislike her. So, whatever impression Mr. Brocklehurst had left upon the pupil in the institution about Jane, she thought that now everybody will dislike her. But then Helen made her understand that everybody knows what kind of a person Mr. Brocklehurst is, and so you do not be worried about that. Okay. Next question. What had Mrs. Reed done? So how did Mrs. Reed, what had Mrs. Reed done when she came to the institution? Yes, Mrs. Reed had fed Mr. Brocklehurst with wrong things about Jane's behavior. She had told him that the girl was not only ungrateful but also told lies. So she had left all the wrong impression about Jane on Mr. Brocklehurst. Why did Miss Temple come to see Jane? So after everything was over during night time, why did Miss Temple came to see Jane? As she could not find the girls anywhere. So Miss Temple came to see Jane on purpose. She knew that Jane was upset after what Mr. Brocklehurst had said about her in the class. So as she knew, Miss Temple knew that Jane was very much upset with what Mr. Brocklehurst said in front of the class. So she came searching for Jane, wanted to speak to her and wanted to console her. Yes, children? So we have just done the revision of the lesson number 5. In short, we have revised it. Go through the lesson, read the full lesson, try to understand the story once again. Okay? Thank you, children.